This is a workflow that I use for creating tiling materials with Zbrush and Substance Designer. Both of the applications are great for doing this, but they have strengths and weaknesses. I like to try and be able to use both collaboratively so that I can just leverage the strengths as much as possible. This tutorial is going to assume that you already know Zbrush and Substance Designer fairly well. I will try and not use too many hotkeys and point out where things actually are in menus. Let's get started by creating a new document and auto-fitting to window size. That just gives us a nice big viewport to work in. I'm going to create a plane 3D, drag it into the canvas, go to edit mode, and turn on the wireframe. The first thing to understand is that the plane within Zbrush, the default primitive, is set up to work with all the brush features, including wrap mode, as if this is one tile. So the end of this plane will start on the beginning over here. We're going to make Polymesh 3D so we can actually sculpt on our plane. And with a standard brush, as I sculpt on one side, I'm not getting any change over here. And that's how we'd expect it to behave, but for making materials that tile, we want it to carry that sculpting detail over to the other side. Luckily, there's an awesome feature for this, and it's within the brush menu. I'm going to open up the brush menu, go under curve, and there's a feature called wrap mode. If I start sculpting with wrap mode, see as I drag outside off the boundary of the geometry, it continues on the top as if I'm kind of offsetting in Photoshop. And that's just awesome. It's a really, really good function. This brush feature is available on every single brush, but I use it so frequently because I'm usually creating materials that I have just added it to my custom UI. And I would recommend doing that for any function or tool that you use frequently, because a lot of these menus things can get buried within them, and it takes too much time to go and find them. So if you find yourself constantly using any feature, add it to your custom UI. So this works great, and you could think, oh, I'm all good, I can just start sculpting away. But there's a few problems right now that we can run into. When I'm making small adjustments to the shape, we should be good. But when we're pushing our pixels around and we make a bigger adjustment, it can start to become more of an issue for the tiling. So let's say that I change my move brush, I turn my wrap mode to 1. I grab an edge, and then I do something major. Now, if I were to take this piece of geometry and snap it directly onto the vertice on the opposite side, it should still be tiling. The projection that we're going to try to make, because we're not actually making a tiling piece of geometry, the ultimate thing we're creating is a texture map, needs to maintain that same square so that we can just easily bake it down. Alright, so what we're going to start doing is rename this guy. We're going to call him Sculpt Plane. And then we're going to make a duplicate. And we're going to rename Sculpt Plane 1 to Projection Plane. And I'm going to grab Projection Plane and use the gizmo to pull him slightly forward. Turn on transparency just so we can kind of see how these guys are related to each other. So they're perfectly aligned. They're within the tiling. If I go back to my sculpt plane, you can see even more clearly that if I do a big move, I'm breaking where this is going to project. So what we need is some extra geometry outside of this guy that will still respect the tiling. And luckily for us, the way wrap mode works, it's based on the size of the object, and the size of one plane is exactly one unit of the wrap mode. So when we set it to 1, it ends here, starts here, the way we've been demonstrating. We can get some extra real estate on here by using ZModeler. I have a button for it, but if you don't, it's press B to pull up the brush menu, Z for Z, brushes that start with Z, and then M for ZModeler. And again, as opposed to having to push 3 keys every time to get that brush, I just have a button to make it easier. Let's look at the wireframe. All right, so let's get over a poly. Hold the spacebar to bring up our menu. Actually, prior to that, so something that will change the behavior of how ZModeler works is that we have backface culling by default. We actually don't want that. We want to go down to, I believe it's display properties, and turn on double. And again, that's one I use a lot. I have a button for it here. All right, so now we can see both of our planes. Let's go to the backside of this guy. And I am going to go to extrude, polygroup island, meaning that it's going to use all of the same polygroup color. And we'll do a one-sided poly. So get over and we'll just extrude out. And now we have some extra geometry. You can notice all the edges are the same polygroup color. So this makes it nice and easy to get some real estate. So now we have our projection plane, but we also have a bunch of extra space to work on. Now the topology on here is bad. We wouldn't want to just subdivide that, so we're going to clean it up. And we also don't need all this extra geometry. So if you're not familiar with ZBrush, deleting polygons is a bit different. The easiest way to do it is to hold Control and Shift, and you're going to get a green box. And only polygons that are fully contained within the box will become selected, and then it will hide everything else. So we're going to get all the front faces, and then all these other faces will be hidden. So we look at it, we have our projection plane and our sculpt plane. Now, we want to Z-remesh this to get better topology, but there's an issue. And if you're not familiar with ZBrush, this is going to confuse you, but I'll try and walk you through it. If I run ZRemodeler under geometry, ZRemesher, you can see that even though that geometry is hidden, it still exists. And when it goes to ZRemesh, it causes all kinds of issues. So what we have to do is go to the geometry itself, modify topology, and then delete hidden. So anything that was hidden on this particular subtool is now gone. So if I run ZRemesher again, I'm going to get a nice, even, quadded up plane that is going to respect our tiling and the wrap mode. And if we bleed out into it, it's not a big deal. We can do a big move with the brush, and we're going to shift, and we'll still have plenty of geometry to occupy our projection space. The next concept that we need to get down is the same rules apply for individual subtools. So let's start off by just appending a cube. The cube is quite large. But it's the same dimensions as our sculpt plane. Let's get something that looks a bit more like a brick or a stone. All right, so just for an example, we have our tile plane. Let's say this stone that we're using is crossing the boundary of our projection plane. We need an exact copy of it to be in the exact same position on the opposite side. So we'll just rename this guy Brick real quick. Now I can go to duplicate, but from now on I'm just going to use the hotkey, which is Control-Shift-D. Now I have two copies of that brick. So how do I get this brick to position on the opposite side and be exactly in the right place? Actually really easy. Go to the Deformation tab. There's an offset feature. And it has an X, Y, and Z axis. So we know we're within the X axis. It'll even say move to X. We take and offset this 100. It'll put it right in the center. Do it again to 200. It is exactly offset as if it were being split by Photoshop from the left to the right. I'm not exactly sure why 200 units is the magic number, but that's what they decided on. Same deal if we wanted to take this guy, or we had another stone, we'll just make another duplicate, move him, and we'll reset his pivot. So it's a little less awkward. Let's say he's intersecting the top, and I need an exact offset down to the bottom. And turn off X, turn on Y, duplicate again, offset once, and then if you want to save yourself the trouble of dragging, you can say repeat to active, and that's just going to offset him again. So now we know this guy is exactly lined up for a projection, and as long as we follow these rules, when we go to bake our final sculpt, everything is going to line up and have no seam. It can get pretty complicated the more complicated your material is. So if you have lots of tiny stones all over the place, you're going to be offsetting a lot. I would highly recommend that if you can, you try to block out most of your model before you start sculpting, if it makes sense. In some cases, you know, you'll sculpt 6 or 7 rocks and make variations of them and move them around. But just plan ahead and it'll save you headaches in the future. And you have the core concepts now to be able to create tiling geometry within ZBrush.